The sweltering summer afternoon of 1980 drew to a close with an unusual silence in a peaceful neighborhood in California. Family cars were still neatly parked along the curb, house doors remained open, but a 12-year-old boy had vanished, as if he had never existed. Neighbors gathered in front yards, whispering over fences as the boy's parents frantically searched every street and bush, with the faint hope that it was just a harmless case of getting lost. Inside the small house, the child's familiar belongings remained exactly where they were, as if he had only stepped away for a moment. As night fell and the police were called, no one knew that this moment would open a case file that would stretch on for decades. Investigators later admitted that the false sense of peace on that day had concealed a tragedy far more complex than anyone could have imagined. And from the moment the boy disappeared, another truth began to be constructed somewhere, quietly waiting for time to reveal it. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. California entered the 1980s with a widespread sense of confidence and optimism in its suburban communities. War was far behind. The economy was gradually stabilizing. New neighborhoods springing up on the outskirts of major cities carried the belief that these were safe places to raise children, where kids could walk to school alone, play outside until dusk, and neighbors knew each other well enough that bad things were rarely considered. The Jones family lived in such a neighborhood, a quiet street with low front yards, little traffic on the internal roads, where most afternoons passed almost identically. They were a typical working-class middle family. The father worked full-time, the mother managed the household, the children attended the local public school system. Their life showed no obvious signs of instability, no serious conflicts, no criminal record, no reason to believe tragedy could strike from within. John Jones, 12 years old, was a child old enough to be trusted, but still immature, tall and skinny compared to his classmates, with dark hair, a face that still had childish features, a quieter personality than many other kids, accustomed to following schedules and rarely doing anything beyond what was allowed. John's weekdays followed a familiar routine: school in the morning, home in the afternoon, sometimes stopping by a friend's house or helping with chores before dinner. He had no history of running away, no major conflicts with family, no expressed desire to leave or avoid someone. That afternoon began just like any other, until John appeared with an acquaintance from the neighborhood, who later became the last witness to see him. Their relationship was close enough not to raise suspicion, normal enough that no one became alarmed, and it was precisely that familiarity that made small details easy to overlook. In the initial moment, there was no action clear enough to call dangerous, just a situation arising outside the usual routine, a proposal that sounded reasonable, a very brief hesitation before John agreed to go along. The witness sensed something not quite right, but that feeling came too quickly, and passed just as fast, rationalized by the thought that John was no longer a very young child, and the surrounding environment was safe enough. When John left sight, there was no cry for help, no signs of struggle, no one running after or stopping to ask more, just a small gap in the familiar chain of afternoon activities. The mistake at that time was not in a big decision, but in the lack of action during those few short minutes, in no one seeing that moment as one needing intervention. As the sun began to set low, and John did not return home on time as usual, the Jones family started to notice the abnormality. At first silent waiting, then short calls to check with neighbors, followed by splitting up to search the neighborhood, calling John's name at places he often visited. The witness returned with fragmented memories, trying to piece together details that had been overlooked earlier, but unable to be certain about the sequence or meaning of them. Time passed, darkness fell, the search area expanded but still yielded no results, and panic began to overtake the hope that John was simply late. By the time familiar streets had been scoured multiple times, and there were no reasonable places left for spontaneous searching, the Jones family was forced to confront the possibility they had been trying to avoid from the start. John was not just temporarily missing. In a state of exhaustion and despair, they contacted the police, officially reporting that their son had disappeared, closing what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, and opening a chain of events that none of them could have foreseen. The missing person call from the Jones family was received in a context with no clear signs of emergency beyond a child not coming home on time, and it was precisely this that shaped the initial response of authorities in the first hours after John disappeared. The case file was opened under standard procedures for missing minors in California at that time, where classifying the incident played a key role in determining priority level and resources mobilized, and from the start, the case was placed in the group needing cause verification before being deemed dangerous. The first officers on scene recorded basic information, quickly checked the surrounding area, while beginning to ask the family familiar questions. Had John ever run away before? Were there any recent conflicts? Any unusual behavior changes? Did he take any belongings or money when leaving? Meanwhile, the family's emotional state made some answers incomplete, some details repeated, some timelines not yet precisely determined, and this inadvertently increased the impression that the incident might stem from John's own impulsive decision, rather than external influence. The last witness to see John was brought in that night, their statement revolving around what happened that afternoon, but since there was no clear act of violence or coercion, the account was recorded as a normal sequence of events, ending with John leaving sight in not overly unusual circumstances. It was the absence of an alarming moment that led the statement to be evaluated as reference value, but not enough to trigger a more serious hypothesis. Investigators focused on reconstructing the last timeline John was seen, determining the time gap from when he left the witness until the family started searching, and this gap, though unclear, was still seen as consistent with a child going off somewhere on his own, and not yet returning. In the initial report, the phrase possible runaway appeared early, and was repeated multiple times, reflecting the common thinking at the time that children John's age could sometimes leave home for unpredictable reasons, even without prior clear signs. The Jones family, in their effort to cooperate, provided full personal information on John, list of friends, school schedule, places he frequented, and the very lack of prominent conflicts or risk factors further reinforced the view that if John left, it might be a momentary action. The key witness was questioned again about small details, but since memories were starting to be influenced by anxiety and self-doubt, some points became more vague than initially, making it hard for investigators to separate certainty from speculation. During this process, the stranger factor appearing that afternoon was noted superficially, not prioritized, as there was no specific identification info, no clearly suspicious behavior described, and no evidence of intentional intervention. Prioritizing the runaway hypothesis led to a cautious but slow approach, where resources were not mobilized at the highest level, and many actions were delayed expecting John might return on his own within hours or days. The final timeline point in the file was locked as the moment John left the witness, but the subsequent gap was not seen as abnormal enough to act as if a kidnapping was in progress, and this decision directly impacted the entire pace of the initial investigation. The Jones family, despite reporting to police, continued searching on their own in parallel, hoping their son would appear while fearing each passing hour would make finding him harder. Meanwhile, investigators completed the shift report, handed the file to superiors, and temporarily closed the first night of the investigation, with the assessment that the case needed further monitoring before a more serious conclusion, a procedural choice that simultaneously laid the foundation for missing key elements from the earliest stage. The next morning, as the hypothesis that John had only temporarily left and not returned began losing persuasiveness with him still completely silent, the investigation's focus shifted to precisely determining the last place John was seen, and what might have happened in the brief time afterward. The last known position area was circled based on the final witness's statement, combined with John's daily habits and possible routes he might take, creating a relatively narrow range but lacking clear landmarks. Investigators returned to the scene, observing every seemingly minor detail of the neighborhood: distances between houses, overlooked side paths, road sections without direct views from windows or front yards, to assess where John might have gone on his own, if no external intervention. A detailed timeline began to be built, starting from when John left home until the family realized he wasn't home on time, each point cross-referenced between family statements, witness, and objective factors, like daylight, neighborhood routine activities, and John's usual daily patterns. As the time points were placed side by side, a notable gap gradually emerged, a period long enough for a significant event, but too short to explain with common scenarios like aimless wandering, or visiting friends without notice. This gap had no direct witnesses, no clear physical traces, but lay exactly at the point John left the last person's sight, making it the central focus of the entire scene investigation phase. Investigators began systematically checking each possibility, from John possibly going somewhere in the area on his own to getting lost or an accident, but each hypothesis quickly hit inconsistencies when fitted into the established timeline. John not taking necessary personal items, no interrupted schedules, and no signs of preparation for leaving made self-departure increasingly illogical. At the same time, no one seeing John move out of the area via main roads, where people usually passed at that time, further weakened the idea he went far on his own. When these factors were compiled, a preliminary conclusion began forming that if John left the last known position area, it most likely did not happen in a normal way, and might involve a factor leaving him unable to control his own path. Investigators also considered John knowing the person who took him, since no resistance or cries were noted, leading to reanalyzing his social connections, from family, friends to neighborhood acquaintances. However, finding no clear links made external intervention suspicion more complex, suggesting someone stranger enough not to be on the known list, but trustworthy enough in that short moment for John to follow without resisting. As the timeline continued refining with new details added, the initial time gap not only didn't narrow but became sharper, like a segment cut out from the normal chain of that afternoon's events. Investigators began asking not just where John went, but how any intervention, if any, happened so quickly without leaving clear traces in a neighborhood considered safe. It was at this stage that gradually eliminating common possibilities shifted the investigation's thinking focus, from searching for a child who might return on his own, to facing the possibility that John's disappearance was not the result of a random decision, but the consequence of a deliberate action, carried out in an extremely short time and exploiting the very complacency of the surrounding environment. As doubts about the possibility of John leaving on his own grew weaker, and the time gap at the last known position area became an unignorable blind spot, the investigation shifted to a large-scale search phase aimed at covering as many possible scenarios as possible in the initial hours after he disappeared. Search parties were organized in waves, starting with family and neighbors, then expanding to community volunteers who were familiar with the terrain and could sweep small roads, vacant lots, walking paths, ditches, and less frequented spaces that a child might pass through or be taken to. Search teams were divided by specific areas, with each team having someone record the time, coverage, and results of the sweep to avoid duplication while ensuring no area was overlooked due to subjective assumptions. In parallel, local resources were mobilized at a higher level, including rescue teams, search dogs, and support vehicles in an expanding radius beyond the initial residential area, reflecting a shift in the assessment of the case's risk level. This mobilization was not only for directly searching for John, but also to determine if there were any signs that he had been removed from the area by some means, a possibility increasingly taken seriously as voluntary departure hypotheses continued to be ruled out. Local media began to get involved, broadcasting information about a missing 12-year-old boy, describing his appearance and the last time he was seen, in the hope that widespread attention might bring new leads from people not directly involved in the search. The media's involvement both added positive pressure to the investigation process and increased the influx of information, forcing investigators to quickly establish a system for receiving and filtering to distinguish between useful leads and inaccurate or speculative reports. During the multi-day search process, a personal item was discovered within a range not too far from the last known position area, and this discovery immediately became the focal point, as it was the first physical trace potentially directly related to John since his disappearance. The location of the item was carefully documented, surrounding conditions were preserved as much as possible, and the evidence was submitted for examination to determine its connection to John and the time it appeared there. However, this seemingly breakthrough discovery created a serious contradiction when placed in the context of the current investigative hypotheses, because the item's location did not fit the scenario of John moving on his own along reasonable routes, nor was it easily explained by the possibility of him dropping it randomly. This contradiction forced investigators to consider the possibility that the evidence had been moved after John's disappearance, or that it was placed there as an indirect consequence of some other action, further complicating an already unclear picture. Search teams continued to expand the scope based on the new discovery, but the failure to find any additional traces further highlighted the isolated and inexplicable nature of this item, making it both a crucial lead and a source of noise if not properly placed in the sequence of events. Meanwhile, the increasingly deep involvement of the community and media raised expectations for a quick resolution, but it also intensified the time pressure on investigators, who had to balance responding to the public with maintaining the accuracy of the investigation. Each day that passed without concrete results gradually reduced the likelihood of finding John in the nearby area, and this was directly reflected in the search organization, as the focus shifted from sweeping every meter of ground to analyzing the meaning of what had and had not been found. The contradiction between the only piece of evidence discovered and the hypotheses being pursued became a central question of this phase. If John did not leave on his own and left no normal traces of movement, then how did that item appear there? And what did it represent in the overall disappearance process? This question, unanswered during the large-scale search phase, created a clear boundary between searching based on the hope that John was still nearby and the need to seriously consider the possibility that he had been removed from his familiar environment under conditions that conventional search activities could not reach. The widespread search yielding no additional physical traces beyond the recorded personal item forced the investigation's focus to shift to what people had seen, heard, or thought they had witnessed during the critical time period of the afternoon John disappeared. Along with the spread of information through local media, a wave of secondary witnesses began to emerge, including residents scattered in and around the last known position area who believed their memories might relate to a boy resembling John. Witness interviews were conducted continuously, with each statement recorded in the hope of filling the unexplained time gap in the timeline, but when compared, these accounts showed a significant lack of consistency. Some witnesses described seeing a boy walking alone with a normal demeanor, others insisted he was with an adult, while a few believed they only caught a glimpse from afar and were unsure if the person was John. These differences were not just in minor details, but in core elements like location, direction of movement, and timing, making it difficult for investigators to determine what information was truly valuable. When questioned further, many witnesses admitted they only connected their memories to the disappearance after seeing news reports or hearing others discuss it, a factor that increased the likelihood of memories being influenced or reconstructed based on new information. Among those who came forward late, Some individuals admitted hesitating due to fear of getting involved, fear of dealing with police, or worry that failing to act in time might be seen as a serious mistake. This hesitation led to some details only being provided after many days, when memory accuracy had diminished and the line between what actually happened and what was inferred became blurred. In some cases, a witness initially provided vague information, but when questioned again with more specific prompts, the statement began to change, not due to intentional deception, but from efforts to fill memory gaps with reasonable assumptions in their own mind. Faced with this situation, investigators conducted cross-verification of all statements, comparing each detail against the established timeline, completed search areas, and objective factors like geographical distance, reasonable travel time, and lighting conditions that afternoon. This cross-verification process revealed that some statements could not coexist, forcing authorities to eliminate information that could not fit into any logical scenario. The remaining statements, though not completely discarded, were only categorized as information requiring caution, as they lacked support from physical evidence or independent witnesses. The parallel existence of multiple unverified statements created significant noise, blurring the line between potential leads and misleading information. Each new statement received opened another line of reasoning, leading to allocation of time and resources for verification, while the chances of those lines yielding concrete results grew lower. Some investigators began to realize that this very abundance of inconsistent information was slowing progress, as it forced the investigation to chase scattered possibilities instead of focusing on key points established from the scene and timeline. In this context, withholding information due to fear of involvement, though not malicious, inadvertently contributed to distorting the overall picture, as details provided late often lacked the initial context needed for proper evaluation. The investigative direction thus became heavily influenced by human factors, where memory, emotions, and personal fears mixed with facts, creating a complex and hard-to-control information environment. Filtering, eliminating, and prioritizing leads became a major challenge, as each decision to dismiss a statement carried the risk that a critical detail might be overlooked, while pursuing all statements led to inevitable dispersion. This very chaos made the investigative direction, already fragile due to lack of physical evidence, even more erratic, placing authorities in the position of choosing between continuing to expand based on conflicting statements or narrowing down and accepting that much of the existing information might never be definitively verified. The chaos caused by conflicting statements forced authorities to re-establish order by narrowing the scope to specific individuals potentially directly linked to the identified time gap in the timeline, and from there a core suspect list gradually formed based on overlaps in location, opportunity, and behavior. Identifying primary suspects was not based on a single lead, but the result of elimination, in which those closely connected to the family, but not present in the area at the critical time, were ruled out, while individuals who had appeared around the neighborhood, had habits of passing through without clear purpose, or had unverifiable schedules were brought under review. From this list, one subject stood out due to multiple converging factors: presence near the last known position area that afternoon, vague statements about their own activities, and an unusual sequence of movements shortly after John's disappearance. Investigators began focusing on analyzing this subject's travel route, comparing stated accounts with objective data such as independent witnesses, daily habits, and feasible geographical distances within the short time frame. Discrepancies quickly emerged, particularly the subject leaving the area in a short period after the incident with an inadequately explained reason, a behavior sufficient to raise suspicion, but not enough to constitute direct evidence. Background checks on criminal history and social connections were conducted in parallel, including reviewing legal records, checking for precedents involving violence, fraud, or approaching minors, as well as interviewing those who had close contact with the subject before and after the disappearance. Initial results showed the subject was not entirely clean in terms of behavior, with some past incidents reflecting instability, but no direct prior convictions related to abduction or child harm, a factor weakening the ability to build a prosecution case. The subject's social relationships were also thoroughly analyzed to determine if anyone might assist or cover suspicious behavior, but most relationships were superficial and provided no confirmation for any scenario. Meanwhile, pressure from the family and community demanding clear progress made focusing on this suspect even heavier, as all eyes turned to the possibility that this was the person responsible for John's disappearance. However, at this stage, a decisive factor began to emerge as investigators were compelled to rigorously verify the subject's alibi within the narrowest time frame of the incident. Alibi verification relied not just on personal statements, but required cross-checking with independent sources, including other witnesses, transaction records, and verifiable activity traces. The verification results showed the subject could be placed elsewhere during a critical part of the time gap, with confirmation from elements that authorities could hardly refute without stronger counter-evidence. The existence of this alibi created a difficult paradox. Suspicious behaviors and timing coincidences remained, but they were insufficient to meet the legal threshold needed to maintain the highest level of suspicion. Faced with this reality, investigators had to consider that the signs making the subject prominent might only be coincidences, or that if involved, the subject's role was not as direct as initially assumed. The case file was carefully re-evaluated, with each detail placed back into the broader context of the case, to avoid letting an initial assumption guide the entire investigative direction. Ultimately, when unable to build a continuous chain of evidence from presence behavior to specific action related to John, the primary suspect had to be removed from core focus, a professional decision, but one that also caused significant disappointment for the family and community awaiting a clear answer. Removing this suspect not only eliminated a direction that had consumed substantial resources, but also left a new void in the effort to find the truth, as it showed that even when an individual converged many suspicious factors, it was still not enough to convincingly explain how John disappeared. This decision, though necessary to ensure investigative objectivity, also exposed the limits of relying on inference without physical evidence or consistent statements, and placed authorities in the position of continuing the search in an increasingly narrow hypothetical space, where each wrong choice could push the truth further away. The elimination of the primary suspect from the investigation after establishing an alibi created a dangerous void in the entire reasoning structure of the case, as too many resources, time, and expectations had been poured into this direction, leaving the rest of the file fragmented and lacking a clear central axis. In that state, an anonymous call forwarded to the investigating agency immediately drew special attention, not only because it arrived just as the investigation was stalling, but also because its content was unusually specific compared to the series of vague tips that had come before. The caller left no identity, but provided details about the context, route, and circumstances surrounding John's disappearance that were detailed enough to suggest this was not entirely fabricated, and at the very least warranted serious consideration. Some information in the call matched elements that had never been widely publicized or had only appeared in a very limited way within the internal file, making it impossible for investigators to simply dismiss it as public rumor. Under pressure to seize every remaining opportunity, the decision was made to pour resources into pursuing this lead, marking a final effort to break the deadlock enveloping the case. Investigation teams were reassigned, prioritizing verification of the locations and situations mentioned in the call, while conducting detailed analysis of every sentence and description to assess the informant's true level of knowledge. In parallel, the investigators handling the file began raising questions about the caller's motives: why speak up only now, why not cooperate directly, and whether the call stemmed from guilt, a desire to help, or some other harder-to-discern purpose. In the early stages of verification, certain elements from the call seemed to bolster the belief that this could be a genuine lead, as descriptions of spaces and the sequence of events could fit into the established timeline without immediate contradictions. This initial compatibility pushed the investigation effort to a high level, with hopes that the remaining gaps in the file would finally be filled. However, as verification delved deeper, investigators began detecting subtle discrepancies, not large enough to immediately dismiss the entire lead, but sufficient to raise doubts about the source's authenticity. Some details about locations and distances, when checked against on-site inspections and objective data, did not fully align with realistic movement possibilities within the stated time frame, while a few other descriptions suspiciously matched what had already been reported in the media. These findings forced the agency to re-ask whether the caller was drawing from direct knowledge or merely synthesizing public information to craft a seemingly convincing story. Efforts to trace the call's origin were conducted within the technological limits of the time, but they yielded only vague results, insufficient to identify the caller's identity, location, or specific connection to John or his family. As the initial assumptions about the lead's reliability were gradually eroded, the investigation entered a phase of comprehensive re-evaluation, in which every detail from the call was weighed against the full body of data collected over the previous weeks. The results of this process gradually revealed that the initial matches could be explained by coincidence or inference from available information, rather than evidence of direct involvement. This assessment led to the conclusion that the anonymous lead, while not provable as entirely fabricated, could not stand as a reliable investigative direction. Within the investigation team, a new suspicion arose, no longer focused on the specific content of the call, but on the possibility that it had been made to misdirect, drawing attention and resources away from other directions, or simply reflecting a desire to interfere with the investigation process for unclear personal reasons. Although there was no concrete evidence of malicious intent, the call's timing at a sensitive moment, and the significant resource drain it caused, meant this suspicion could not be ignored. As this final lead was gradually deprioritized, the overall picture of the case emerged with a troubling level of emptiness. No primary suspect left, no new physical evidence, and witness statements continuing to exist in irreconcilable contradiction. The deadlock became clear, not due to lack of effort, but because every viable path within the current investigative framework seemed to have been tested and successively closed off. Investigators were forced to acknowledge that continuing to pursue baseless hypotheses would only increase the risk of error, while the absence of new breakthroughs prevented the file from advancing further. The collapse of the anonymous lead not only marked the end of a specific investigative direction, but also exposed the limits of the entire process up to that point, where the truth about John's disappearance remained out of reach, and all prior efforts, despite being carried out with the utmost seriousness, had still not been enough to break through the silence enveloping the case. The collapse of the final anonymous lead pushed the investigation into a state of true exhaustion, not in the sense that all questions had been answered, but in the sense that no viable path forward remained without relying on speculation or unsubstantiated assumptions. What was left in the file at this point was a dense collection of reports, statements, search maps, and analytical notes, but no new data capable of shifting the situation. Investigators reviewed the entire process from the beginning, performing a final check on discarded hypotheses, reassessing the value of each lead, and arriving at the same unwelcome conclusion: every investigative avenue within the available resources, technology, and information had been exploited to its limit. The decision to suspend the investigation was not made abruptly, but was the result of a gradual acceptance that continuing to pursue the case in its current state would only waste further time and manpower without increasing the chances of uncovering the truth. The case file was shifted from active investigation status to storage, labeled as a cold case, accurately reflecting the situation, an unsolved case with no further progress. Documents were reorganized according to archival standards, categorized by witnesses, physical evidence, suspects, and hypotheses, to ensure that if conditions for reopening arose in the future, all information could still be accessed systematically. This archiving was, technically, a necessary step to preserve data, but psychologically, it marked the end of an intense period of effort lasting many weeks, where each passing day had been tied to the fragile hope that some detail would emerge to break the deadlock. John Jones's family did not receive a clear notification that the case had been classified as a cold case. They only sensed the change through the gradual thinning and near cessation of update calls, responses from the agency becoming shorter and more procedural, and search activities no longer being organized or publicized as before. This silence was not intentional indifference, but a consequence of a system forced to prioritize cases with potential for progress. Yet for the family, it carried the meaning of being left behind, as their unrelieved anxiety persisted while external support gradually vanished. Meanwhile, the John Jones file lay dormant in storage alongside numerous other unsolved cases, each representing an unfinished story and a set of unanswered questions. The case becoming a cold case did not mean investigators believed John was dead, or that the truth did not exist, but rather reflected the limits of what could be done at that time, when technology was not advanced enough for deeper analysis of connections, and investigative methods relied heavily on physical evidence and direct statements. During the organization and archiving process, certain details were flagged as unexplained, including the contradiction between the location of found personal items and the constructed hypotheses, as well as a short but critical time gap in the timeline that no witness could fill. These details were noted with the hope that they might hold meaning in a different context, though at the time no one could predict what that context would be, or when it might arrive. John's family continued searching for answers in their own way, retaining copies of the file, noting down minor details they deemed important, and maintaining informal contact with some individuals who had participated in the search. But these efforts could not replace an active official investigation. The lack of regular updates forced them to confront a sense of isolation, as every question they asked led to the same response: no new information to share. Within the archived file itself, there existed at least one detail that had not received proper attention at the time, not because it was hidden, but because it did not fit any prioritized hypothesis, causing it to be set aside as unclassifiable data. This detail, buried among reports and notes, was not treated as an independent lead, nor connected to other elements in the file, and thus did not trigger any additional investigative action. The existence of such overlooked details is not uncommon in prolonged cases, where investigators' attention is drawn to more promising directions, and data that does not fit the temporary overall picture is temporarily sidelined. When the John Jones case was officially classified as a cold case, this status carried no conclusion but merely a temporary period at the end of an investigative chapter, where the truth remained out of reach, and all answers were postponed indefinitely. While the John Jones file lay dormant in storage as an unsolved case, elsewhere, the life of the boy who had once disappeared continued, but under a completely different name, a new identity used as if it had always existed, and there was never anything to question. The person bearing this identity grew up in an environment tightly controlled in terms of information, where the past was not referenced as a story that could be recounted, but existed only in the form of minimal details sufficient to answer basic external questions. There was no awareness of having once been a missing child, no memories named or labeled to connect to another family, and no clear signs indicating that the identity in use was not genuine. What was known about oneself was limited to what had been told, simple biographical milestones, and a seemingly seamless flow of daily life, even though beneath it lay gaps that could not be self-explained. The lack of awareness of true identity was not the result of conscious denial but a consequence of growing up in a process where information was selectively provided, enough to create a sense of normalcy, but not enough to form a complete picture of origins. Those fragmented memories that had been smoldering for a long time began to form a more distinct sense of dissonance as life under the new identity gradually entered a phase that demanded consistency in the past, where seemingly harmless questions about childhood origins, and personal milestones started appearing more frequently and could no longer be easily brushed aside. Memories of the early years always carried a hazy quality, not in the natural way of childhood forgetfulness, but as if they had never been fully formed from the beginning, lacking the foundational images that most people use to recount their own story. What could be remembered was often feelings rather than events, scattered impressions not tied to specific locations, people, or sequences, making it impossible to piece them together into a coherent timeline. When trying to recall, there were no familiar scenes of the first home, no fixed faces of family members across different stages, and no common memory markers like the first day of school or recurring family events. This lack of childhood data existed not only in personal memory, but was clearly reflected in related records, where the earliest documents often started later than normal, skipping a significant period that should have had administrative, medical, or educational traces. Questions about childhood photos, vaccination records, or initial school enrollment often received vague answers, sometimes contradictory, and gradually formed a consistent pattern of avoidance whenever the distant past was mentioned. The story of the early years, when recounted in different contexts, failed to maintain the necessary stability, with details shifting depending on the listener or situation, as if there was no standard version committed to memory, but only temporary pieces assembled to fit the moment. Sometimes the place of birth was mentioned vaguely, other times placed in a different unverifiable location, and milestones like moving homes or changing schools did not align when cross-checked over time. These changes were not large enough to be immediately seen as signs of a fabricated story, but sufficient to create a lasting foundation of instability, where the past did not stand still but continuously shifted slightly, like a painting redrawn multiple times without an original to compare against. Among those smoldering inconsistencies, the date of birth became a particularly sensitive element, as it is the most basic personal marker yet showed unexplained discrepancies. Some documents presented the birth date one way, while stories told within the family or to outsiders suggested a different time, and this difference, though small numerically, had a major impact on the sense of authenticity of the entire identity. Chance cross-checks between documents or quick questions from outside forced responses that exposed awkwardness, not due to simple lack of memory, but because there was no fixed marker to hold on to. Over time, the birth date contradiction was not resolved definitively, but only covered with temporary explanations, making it a potential weak point in the identity structure. These abnormal signs did not appear all at once, but stretched over many years, sparse enough not to cause panic, but persistent enough to create a feeling of incompleteness about the past. Each time having to retell the childhood story, even in casual conversations, carried an invisible pressure, because keeping the details non-contradictory required attention that people with genuine memories rarely need. Gradually, talking about the past became something to avoid, not because there was something consciously to hide, but because there was no certainty to tell a consistent story. This avoidance, over time, further reduced opportunities to cross-check and correct discrepancies, making them fixed as part of personal reality. Those prolonged abnormal signs did not converge into a clear conclusion, but they created a foundation of silent doubt, where the sense of self was not entirely solid despite no specific evidence to deny it. Childhood, instead of being a seamless chain of memories leading to the present, existed as a foggy region, with isolated bright spots not enough to illuminate the entire picture. In that state, the current identity still functioned normally on the surface, but underneath was a structure lacking foundation, where small contradictions accumulated over the years, waiting for suitable conditions to be recognized, not as isolated inconveniences, but as signs of a larger untold story. The smoldering contradictions of childhood did not disappear upon entering adulthood. On the contrary, they gradually revealed themselves more clearly in situations requiring official confirmation of identity. where administrative systems do not accept hazy feelings or flexible stories as people often do. Procedures involving personal documents, from education and employment to basic legal requirements, began posing questions that had never arisen before, forcing the provision of detailed information about the past, place of birth, upbringing process, and personal milestones that seemed obvious. It was in those moments that administrative difficulties became the clearest manifestation of a prolonged identity void, when necessary data either did not exist or existed in incomplete forms, lacking logical connections between stages. Forms requiring family information often left blanks hard to fill, as tracing genealogy became impossible without a clear starting point, without verifiable names, addresses, or relationships beyond what had been vaguely recounted. The inability to trace genealogy was not just an informational limitation, but a repeated experience of disconnection, when those around easily mentioned grandparents, relatives, family traditions, while oneself had nothing but a void accepted as normal. Over time, avoiding the past became a natural strategy to minimize discomfort and risk, not out of intent to conceal, but because facing questions without clear answers always led to a feeling of loss of control. Conversations revolving around childhood, origins, or biological family were gradually redirected or ended early, and this avoidance, though initially just a momentary reaction, became a deeply ingrained habit in social interactions. Personal records accordingly reflected the fragmented state, with documents existing sporadically, discontinuous in time, and sometimes contradictory in content, creating an incomplete administrative picture, but still sufficient to function under normal conditions. This fragmentation was rarely detected directly, as systems usually checked individual parts separately, but it always carried the potential risk of identity exposure whenever data was cross-checked more deeply or placed side by side in special circumstances. Each time having to provide detailed personal information carried a certain level of stress, not because of fear of discovering something specific, but because there could be no certainty that the pieces would fit together perfectly. The risk of identity exposure, in this context, did not mean an immediate revelation of truth, but the possibility that accumulated small contradictions would be enough to make others question, leading to deeper verification demands without the foundation to meet them. This concern, though unnamed, influenced major life decisions, from choosing work environments, degree of commitment to relationships, to approaching opportunities requiring high transparency about background. Growing up in that context meant building oneself on an unstable foundation, where every achievement was tied to efforts of adaptation and avoidance of inherent weaknesses in personal records. Gradually, the identity void was no longer just a past issue, but became part of the present, affecting self-perception and one's position in the surrounding world. Questions once ignored in youth returned in different forms, no longer mere curiosity, but practical demands of adult life, and each time, the lack of information was exposed a bit more. In that fragile balance, life continued, but always with the feeling that something remained unfinished, that the identity in use was enough to exist, but not enough to fully understand oneself. The risk of identity exposure, though never occurring specifically, still lingered as a prolonged shadow, reminding that the current structure could be shaken at any time, if the right questions were asked, and that the identity void, if not filled, would continue to dominate both personal choices and interactions with the world throughout adulthood. The prolonged identity void, from adulthood, gradually revealed itself not only through subjective feelings or scattered administrative difficulties, but also through the very structure of personal records, when placed side by side and examined as a whole. Where documents expected to be consistent showed contradictions that could not be explained by random errors. The most basic documents, such as identification papers, educational records, and various administrative forms, displayed mismatched details on foundational information, from place of birth and early life timelines, to data considered fixed throughout a person's life. These contradictions did not appear as a single obvious error, but were dispersed into many small discrepancies, enough for each individual document to still be accepted, but when cross-referenced, they revealed a systematic lack of synchronization. Medical records further highlighted this discontinuity, with no traceable continuous care chain from infancy, unexplained data gaps, unexplained changes in healthcare facilities, and absence of important records, typically associated with early years. What existed in medical records resembled a collection of late-starting fragments, making long-term health history determination difficult, and simultaneously raising questions about what had been omitted or removed beforehand. When these documents were examined together, signs of forgery began to emerge not as crude edits, but as the result of sophisticated interventions aimed at creating a legally sufficient surface to pass routine checks. Stamps, signatures, and form formats might comply with standards of each period, but content consistency was not achieved, indicating interventions to legitimize the identity, rather than truthfully reflect a seamless personal history. These interventions were not random, as they focused on the most critical milestones, where origin verification is typically conducted, while ignoring secondary details less likely to be cross-checked. This approach suggested intentional concealment, where the goal was not to create a perfect story, but to build a structure strong enough not to be questioned in daily interactions. This concealment behavior manifested through consistent avoidance of requests for original documents, preference for copies or substitute papers, and readiness to explain contradictions with vague reasons when questioned. Over time, these strategies created a fog surrounding the true origin, making tracing back increasingly difficult as initial traces had been blurred or replaced. The inability to trace origins was not just a consequence of passing time, but the result of a series of decisions to sever links that could lead back to the starting point, from changing identification information to allowing old records not to be retained or dispersed across multiple systems. In that context, every cross-checking effort led to the same outcome: no straight path connecting present to past, only systematically created dead ends. Tampering with personal records, therefore, was not a single act, but a prolonged process, maintained long enough to become the default state of the existing identity. This explains why the contradictions, though clearly present, did not lead to immediate collapse of the identity structure, as they were distributed and covered in a way that no agency or individual held the full picture. Confronting these signs of tampering did not create a distinct moment of awakening, but was like gradually realizing that what had been seen as random shortcomings were actually manifestations of intentional design. In that state, ease no longer attached only to personal memory or administrative difficulties, but expanded into awareness that the current identity was maintained through a sophisticated chain of concealment, where truth was not completely erased, but pushed beyond the reach of ordinary verification tools. The inability to trace origins thus became a core characteristic of personal records, not due to lack of search effort, but because paths leading to the past had been tampered with from the start, causing every query to return to the present without going further. The growing awareness that personal records had been systematically tampered with gradually eroded the value of familiar verification methods, as any document based on paperwork, administrative archives, or oral accounts risked reflecting a story that had been altered at its root. In that context, the need to turn to a form of data that could not be easily manipulated became more urgent, not as a deliberate investigative act, but as a natural effort to find an objective anchor for a sense of self that was becoming increasingly uncertain. DNA testing emerged in thought in that way, not as a journey to search for biological family or a stolen past, but as a neutral scientific tool, detached from the contradictory stories that had clung to the current identity for years. The decision to approach DNA testing was not tied to an explosive moment or a strong emotional impulse, but formed gradually as a result of elimination, when every other path led to a dead end or only reaffirmed that the existing data was unreliable. It was approached cautiously, viewed as a way to gather additional information for oneself rather than a life-changing turning point, and that very approach made the decision psychologically easier to accept. The initial purpose of the test was not aimed at searching for biological family or re-establishing origins, but focused on personal information such as genetic traits, health risks, or simply curiosity about one's own biological structure, factors that did not require confronting complex social or emotional consequences. Choosing a popular commercial testing service further reinforced the feeling that this was a normal action, part of a broader modern societal trend where millions of people submit DNA samples for widely varying reasons without expecting any shocking discoveries. The sample collection process was simple, almost detached from the complex identity story that had formed earlier, and sending the sample was carried out as a technical procedure rather than a symbolic act. When the DNA data was entered into the system, it became an anonymous genetic code amid a vast database, where each individual profile was just a data point in a large statistical network. There was no indication that this sample was handled differently or flagged specially, and from the provider's perspective, everything seemed to end the moment the sample was submitted. The waiting period for results began without notable excitement or anxiety, as there was no expectation that the test would yield anything beyond general genetic information. The waiting time passed amid everyday life continuing, where issues of identity, records, and the past persisted, but no tool was yet powerful enough to address them, and the DNA test was seen merely as supplementary data, not the key to resolution. This very lack of expectation created a passive waiting state, where the mind was not occupied by hypothetical scenarios, and there was no mental preparation for the possibility that the results might open larger questions. During that time, no actions were taken to connect the DNA data with other records, no intent to use the results for comparison with any missing persons lists or legal databases, and the testing was kept entirely personal. However, even though the sample provider attached no great significance to it, entering the DNA data into the system meant it began participating in an automatic matching process where algorithms compared, analyzed, and searched for connections continuously without human intervention or awareness. In that network, biological data carried no story or motive, existing only as a sequence ready to be compared with others, and it was precisely this impartiality of the system that created the potential to detect connections that traditional methods could not reach. While waiting for results, the unease about identity did not completely disappear, but it also did not increase significantly, as the DNA test was not yet seen as a challenge to the current life structure. It existed as a new variable added to the equation, but without signs that it would alter the outcome, and thus did not disrupt daily thoughts. Not aiming to find biological family helped maintain a safe emotional distance, keeping the process free from deep expectations or fears of discovering an uncontrollable truth. The DNA test, in that state, was viewed as a potential but non-urgent source of information, data that could be referenced in the future if needed, rather than the center of the personal journey. The waiting time for results thus stretched on without forewarning signs, with no intermediate events suggesting that something unusual was happening behind the scenes. However, the very fact that the data had been entered into the system created a hidden turning point, as from that moment, it was no longer under the absolute control of the provider, but became part of a larger matching network, where connections could be detected regardless of the original intent. This turning point lay not in personal emotion or decision, but in the intersection of biological data and modern analytical technology, where long-severed connections could be recreated solely through probability and statistics. While the sample provider continued life thinking they were merely waiting for a reference report, the DNA data had begun its own separate journey in the system, where it had the potential to collide with other profiles without any human initiative. It was precisely this separation between personal perception and the automatic matching process that turned what seemed like a small step into a potential pivotal point, where a hidden past and the present could intersect in ways no one could predict. Within the framework of this moment, the DNA test remained a personal action, not yet carrying investigative meaning or greater truth-seeking, but entering the data into the system had quietly laid the foundation for possibilities beyond the original purpose, where answers, if they appeared, would come from the connections themselves without invitation. The DNA data, entered into the system, continued to exist quietly until a match appeared without any forewarning, not a direct match between closely related individuals, but a genetic connection distant enough not to immediately create personal awareness, yet clear enough to trigger deeper analysis from the system. The result showed a match with a group of distant relatives, people not part of any known family story, and the existence of this connection immediately raised a fundamental question about biological origins that had never been firmly established. The distant relative match did not provide direct answers, but it offered a completely new starting point, as each genetic connection could be expanded through building a family tree, a process of analysis based on relationship branches, geography, and time to gradually narrow the search. Algorithms and experts began constructing the family tree from the initial matches, tracing family branches across generations, cross-referencing with public records such as birth certificates, marriage records, and other demographic data to identify potential intersection points. This process did not happen quickly or linearly, as each branch opened up multiple possibilities, requiring continuous elimination of directions incompatible with geography or timing. As the family tree became detailed enough, some branches began converging on a specific geographic area and time period, creating an intersection more meaningful than previous hypotheses. From there, narrowing down the identity became feasible, not by immediately pointing to a specific individual, but by identifying a small group of people who could fit the biological profile and established time context. This narrowing relied on a combination of factors, including biological age inferred from DNA, migration timelines of family branches in the tree, and compatibility between known personal data and gaps in the current records. When these factors were placed side by side, some possibilities were eliminated for mismatch, while others emerged as potential candidates for the true biological origin. It was at this stage that the connection to a cold case from 1980 began to appear, not as an emotional hypothesis, but as a logical result of data cross-referencing. A missing minors case from that year, long dormant in archives, had notable overlaps with parameters inferred from the family tree, including age, geographic area, and basic personal characteristics. Linking to this cold case did not happen abruptly, but as a result of gradual elimination, as other possibilities were successively ruled out for incompatibility. The old case began receiving attention again, not because new clues emerged within it, but because the DNA data created a new context for rereading information previously deemed insignificant. Details once overlooked or unplaceable in any hypothesis began to be examined in a new light when placed alongside the genealogical results and genetic matches. The renewed attention to the old case did not come with preconceived conclusions, but opened a new chain of questions about the link between current biological data and a case once considered dead-ended. The cross-referencing aimed not to immediately affirm an identity, but to determine the degree of compatibility between two datasets never previously compared. In this process, differences were carefully noted, as not every match was decisive, and the risk of overinterpretation always existed when new data generated excitement. However, as similarities continued to accumulate through each analysis round, the likelihood that this connection was mere coincidence became increasingly hard to accept. The family tree construction continued to be refined to further narrow the scope, identifying the branches most likely related to the missing persons case, while eliminating those incompatible with time and location constraints. This process required coordination between automated data and manual evaluation, where each elimination decision was based on careful consideration to avoid missing important possibilities. When identity narrowing reached a sufficiently tight level, the 1980 cold case was no longer one of many possibilities, but the clearest convergence point of the available data. Renewed attention to the old case was not merely reopening a file, but placing it in a new network of connections, where questions once unanswered could now be approached with tools and methods unavailable at the original time. Though no official conclusion was reached in this phase, the DNA match created an irreversible turning point, as it completely changed the view of the past, turning a case once seen as dead-ended into one potentially directly connected to a living person, and laying the groundwork for re-evaluating assumptions that had persisted for decades. The 1980 missing persons case, unexpectedly becoming the clearest convergence point of genetic data, forced the investigative system to shift from passive observation to official action, and the cold case unit was activated to take over the case in a context entirely different from the initial investigation. For this specialized unit, taking over did not mean assuming a preconceived conclusion, but starting anew with a new set of tools, where DNA data served as the starting point rather than the final answer. The file was retrieved from storage, checked for preservation condition, completeness, and accuracy of original documents, then digitized and restructured for modern analysis. DNA data comparison became the central step in reopening, not limited to confirming the previously detected distant relative matches, but expanding to cross-referencing with other related DNA samples, including family data from the old case victim if still existing or collectible anew. This comparison was conducted in layers, from genetic probability analysis to evaluating compatibility with demographic information recorded in the missing persons file, ensuring all conclusions were based on convergence of multiple independent data sources. Concurrently, cross-referencing the missing persons file was done systematically, not just reviewing the case summary, but scrutinizing every witness report, every search map, every investigator's note from the earliest days. Details once seen as contradictory or insufficient were placed in the new context created by DNA data, and in this process, matching points began emerging in ways previously unrecognizable. Some descriptions of the victim's age, appearance, and behavior in the old file surprisingly aligned with biological traits inferred from current data, while gaps that once stalled the case now fit a scenario of a child involuntarily separated from their original environment. Discoveries of matching details did not occur as a single illuminating moment, but as gradual accumulation of small similarities, each individually perhaps unconvincing, but together forming a logical structure hard to deny. Cold case unit investigators paid special attention to details overlooked or undervalued in the first investigation, not because they were hidden, but because no context existed then to understand their meaning. Some witness notes, evidence items, and time gaps were re-examined in the light of new data, and questions once unanswered now had clearer approaches. Old clues were recovered not by finding new information in the file, but by reconnecting existing information differently, creating inference chains previously impossible. Reopening the case was thus not a repetition of the old investigation, but a comprehensive restructuring, where each element was re-evaluated for contribution to a new picture. The cold case unit reclassified all data, identifying parts needing further verification, parts eliminable, and parts requiring deeper priority investigation. In this process, evaluation standards also changed, as what was once deemed insufficient evidence in the old context could now gain value when supported by genetic data. DNA data comparison not only aimed to confirm biological links, but was used as a tool to check overall file consistency, detecting anomalies or contradictions once seen as random. When investigators placed biological data alongside old reports, they realized some initial assumptions had inadvertently obscured other possibilities, and reopening allowed escape from that mindset. Coordination between scientific analysis and traditional investigative evaluation created a new pace for the case, where each advance was carefully weighed to avoid repeating past mistakes. Discoveries of matching details continued to strengthen as timelines in the missing persons file were cross-referenced with current personal data, showing compatibility hard to explain as random coincidence. Clues once seen as disconnected began linking, not by speculation, but by independent data converging in one direction. Old clue recovery was accompanied by high caution, as the cold case unit knew reopening an old case carried not only opportunity, but risk of error if overly committed to a single hypothesis. Each analysis step was documented in detail, each provisional conclusion treated as an assumption needing further verification, and no result was considered final in this phase. However, as reopening progressed, one thing became increasingly clear. The 1980 missing persons case was no longer a forgotten investigation, but the focus of a new one, where DNA data acted as the catalyst reviving questions once buried. Reopening the case was thus not merely an administrative decision, but recognition that past limitations could be overcome when suitable tools emerged, and that truth, though delayed for decades, could still be approached when old clues were viewed in an entirely different context. The reopening of the missing person case with the official involvement of the cold case unit created a critical requirement to shift from probability-based inference to identity confirmation at the highest legal and scientific level, because only when the identity is proven beyond dispute does the entire prior chain of analysis gain practical value. Direct DNA collection became a mandatory step, no longer relying on indirect samples or distant relative matches, but aiming to establish an absolute biological connection between the living individual and the 1980 missing person case. This process was conducted under strict protocols, ensuring voluntariness, sample validity, and continuous chain of custody from collection to analysis to eliminate any possibility of error or future disputes. The direct DNA sample was compared against existing data in the system, including prior distant relative matches and any other related samples that could be obtained from the victim's family in the old case file, forming a dense comparison network sufficient to establish biological relationship beyond reasonable doubt. In parallel with DNA analysis, biometric medical cross-verification was implemented as an independent verification axis because identity does not exist solely at the biological level, but is also reflected through a lifelong data chain over time. Investigators reviewed birth certificates, school enrollment records, school transfers, vaccination records, and medical documents from early life, placing them alongside current data to determine the degree of continuity or disruption. Gaps that had previously been puzzling began to fit into a more logical context, as the absence of records during a certain period aligned with the scenario of a child being separated from their original environment and living under a different identity. This cross-verification did not aim for perfect matches, as that would be nearly impossible after decades, but rather for overall compatibility between timelines, personal characteristics, and biological data. Features such as biological age inferred from DNA, general health history, and developmental markers consistent with the age at the time of disappearance were all incorporated into the analysis, creating a multidimensional picture of identity. When the analysis results were compiled, the degree of match reached a threshold where investigators could no longer explain it as random coincidence, and the identity of John Jones began to be regarded as a well-founded conclusion rather than an investigative hypothesis. However, identity confirmation did not stop at internal conclusions, but had to be formalized through evaluation and approval steps under legal regulations to ensure that the conclusion could withstand any independent scrutiny. DNA analysis reports were prepared in detail, clearly stating methods, probabilities, and error margins, while biometric medical cross-verification documents were systematized to illustrate the convergence of multiple different data sources. The formalization process included presenting results to appropriate authorities within the investigative agency, ensuring that every step complied with current standards and did not overlook any factor that could affect the legality of the conclusion. When John Jones's identity was confirmed at the scientific and legal level, the 1980 missing person case officially changed status from an unsolved case to one where the victim was determined to be alive, a profound turning point for the entire investigative process. This confirmation not only closed a decades-long question about the fate of a child, but also opened a series of new questions about what had happened during the concealed period, the mechanisms that allowed a different identity to exist legally for so long, and the accompanying legal and social consequences. However, within the scope of this phase, the focus remained on ensuring that the identity conclusion was built on a solid foundation, uninfluenced by emotion or external pressure. Investigators were fully aware that identity confirmation was an irreversible step, and any error at this stage could undermine the entire subsequent process. Therefore, every conclusion was re-examined, every piece of data cross-verified, and every assumption challenged before being accepted as part of the final result. When the formalization process was complete, John Jones's identity no longer existed as a possibility or probability, but became an officially recorded fact, with full scientific and legal basis. This confirmation simultaneously marked the end of an investigative phase based on inference and data analysis, and paved the way for subsequent steps that were more human in nature, where the consequences of reclaiming identity would be addressed at both individual and societal levels. At this moment, the most important thing was that the identity had been confirmed with certainty, creating the indispensable foundation for all subsequent actions to be carried out within the framework of the law and verified truth, ensuring that the story of John Jones, after decades of separation, finally had a solid anchor to continue being resolved comprehensively. The confirmation of John Jones's identity with scientific and legal certainty forced the investigative process to move into its most sensitive phase, where data was no longer the sole focus and human beings became the central element in every decision. From this point, how the truth was conveyed was just as important as the truth itself, because the recipient was not a case file or an investigative subject, but an individual who had lived their entire adult life under a different identity, with a system of memories, relationships, and selfhood built on that foundation. The approach to the victim was designed in clear sequential steps, with coordination between investigative agencies, clinical psychologists, and experts experienced in handling late identity disclosures, to ensure that the initial contact was not confrontational or shocking. The choice of who would make direct contact, the setting, and the language used were all carefully considered, because the goal was not to announce an investigative conclusion, but to initiate a process of absorbing the truth that could be prolonged and highly emotionally volatile. When the approach took place, information was not presented as a definitive statement from the outset, but introduced gradually, starting with confirmation that new findings directly related to personal identity had emerged, and that these findings needed to be explained carefully. This controlled disclosure aimed to create a psychological buffer, allowing the victim to ask questions, react, and process layers of information rather than being overwhelmed by a comprehensive shock. As core data about DNA testing and the connection to a historical missing person case began to be presented, the initial reaction was often skepticism, not in the sense of emotional denial, but as a natural defense mechanism against the possibility that the entire story of oneself might have been entirely different from what had been believed. The identity crisis that formed from this point did not take the form of an explosive reaction, but rather a fragmented state, where the victim tried to hold on to familiar elements of self while confronting new information that threatened to collapse the old cognitive structure. Scattered memories previously seen as meaningless began to be viewed in a different light, and this very shift made the processing heavier, as it forced the victim to re-examine the entire past through a completely new lens. The disclosure of information continued to be adjusted based on observed psychological reactions, not aiming to force immediate acceptance, but to ensure the victim did not fall into overload leading to emotional numbness or prolonged denial. Psychologists conducted ongoing assessments, monitoring signs of stress, anxiety, cognitive disruption, and emotional stability levels to determine whether the disclosure process needed to be paused or paced differently. The identity crisis in this phase was not just about asking "who am I?" but also entailed deeper issues regarding the meaning of existing relationships, the value of past decisions, and the sense of control over one's life. The victim might experience a state of internal conflict between protecting the current identity and being unable to ignore evidence pointing to a different truth, and this very conflict created prolonged psychological pressure. Throughout the process, investigative agencies and support teams emphasized that identity confirmation did not negate or erase lived experiences, but only added a new contextual layer to understand them, aiming to reduce the feeling that the life lived had been a complete lie. Psychological impact assessment did not stop at immediate reactions, but also considered the risk of developing long-term issues such as depression, anxiety disorders, or prolonged identity crises, especially in the context of processing information about having been separated from biological family at a very young age. Experts weighed the victim's readiness to receive additional information, including details about the disappearance circumstances and the existence of a family that had searched for decades, because disclosing too early or too quickly could heighten feelings of betrayal or loss. In this phase, preparation for possible reunion was raised as a scenario requiring careful planning, not as a high-emotion climax event, but as a tightly controlled process to minimize trauma for all involved parties. This preparation included assessing the extent to which the victim had reached acceptance of the newly confirmed identity, the ability to face the biological family without being swept into guilt or anger, and the level of psychological support needed before, during, and after any contact. However, within the framework of the truth disclosure phase, the focus remained on helping the victim stabilize, rebuild inner security, and gradually integrate the new information into their self-perception. The identity crisis was viewed as a process, not a problem to be resolved quickly, and allowing the victim to go through stages of denial, doubt, anger, or sadness was seen as necessary to avoid deeper psychological consequences later. As information was absorbed gradually and structured, the initial state of chaos began to shift into a period of reflection, where the victim no longer merely reacted to data, but started asking about its meaning for current and future life. It was in this phase that the role of psychological impact assessment became decisive, as it directly affected the victim's ability to actively participate in subsequent steps without feeling controlled or imposed upon. Reunion preparation, though not yet specifically implemented, began to be considered as a realistic possibility, requiring the highest respect and caution, ensuring that any subsequent steps would be built on psychological stability, rather than driven by emotional pressure or external expectations. In this phase, the truth had been removed from the realm of investigative files and become a personal reality being processed step by step, and the way it was disclosed, supported, and integrated would determine not only the victim's experience, but also the humanity of the entire process of resolving a case spanning more than 4 decades. The psychological foundation established during the truth disclosure phase became a prerequisite for moving to a completely different stage of the case, where data and files gave way to people and emotions that had gone unprocessed for decades, and thus the preparation of the meeting was conducted with the highest level of caution. The reunion was not viewed as a single emotional moment, but as a process with the potential to cause harm if not properly managed, because the vast time gap had created 2 parallel worlds with entirely different experiences, memories, and understandings. Psychologists were involved from the preparation stage, working separately with each side to assess readiness levels, expectations, and potential concerns, to minimize the chance that the meeting would be dominated by extreme emotions or unrealistic projections. The biological family, who had lived for years in a state of unanswered waiting, had to confront the reality that the child they lost no longer existed as in their memories, but had become an adult with their own identity and life, while the victim had to prepare to meet people who were complete strangers, yet carried the designation of biological family. Preparation therefore focused on adjusting expectations, emphasizing that the meeting was not intended to recreate the past or immediately compensate for losses, but was merely the first step in a process of recognition and acquaintance. When the direct meeting with the biological family was arranged, the space and timing were chosen to create a sense of safety and neutrality, avoiding elements that could heighten emotional pressure. The presence of experts was not actively interventional, but served to observe and provide support when needed, ensuring that strong reactions were addressed promptly before escalating into crisis. The first moment of facing each other did not unfold like simplistic visions of tears or overwhelming embraces, but was quiet and tense, as each side tried to recognize the other in a blend of familiarity and strangeness. The biological family noted similarities in appearance, gestures, or voice, but also recognized undeniable differences shaped by time and different life circumstances, causing emotions to surge yet be restrained. The victim's reaction was markedly defensive, not due to lack of emotion, but because confronting a large volume of emotional information in a short time forced the psyche to erect boundaries for self-protection. Initial words were probing, avoiding deep dives into painful details, reflecting efforts from both sides to keep the meeting within tolerable limits. Experts noted that reactions from each side were uneven, as each person carried a different emotional history, and some members expressing strong emotions while others remained silent, was entirely normal in late reunions. Expert intervention primarily involved regulating pace, encouraging pauses when necessary, and reminding parties to focus on the present, rather than attempting to explain or resolve the entire past in a single meeting. During the process, reactions were recorded not only through words, but also through body language, eye avoidance, or prolonged silences, all viewed as important indicators of psychological state. Reunion in reality did not bring a sense of complete closure but clearly exposed gaps that could not be filled immediately, from differences in memories and life values, to understandings of the lost years. The biological family had to face the reality that they could not demand roles or relationships as if time had not passed, while the victim had to process vague guilt for being unable to meet the emotional expectations perceived from the family. Experts continued post-meeting support, helping parties understand that feelings of disappointment or incompleteness were not signs of failure, but natural responses to a reunion occurring too late. Incomplete reunion became the central characteristic of this phase, not due to lack of goodwill, but because no template existed to piece together lost years without leaving cracks. Some questions could not be fully answered, some emotions could not be immediately named, and accepting that became an important part of the adaptation process. The first meeting was therefore seen as a starting point rather than a destination, a trial step to determine whether parties could continue building connection at a level that did not cause further harm. The presence of experts helped reaffirm that maintaining distance or slow progress did not equate to rejection, but was a way to protect psychological health in a situation without personal precedent. As the reunion phase unfolded, there was no sense of clear victory or conclusion, only acknowledgement that a new chapter had opened with many limitations and uncertainties. Reunion in this context was not a full return to the biological family, but the first time placing people separated by time and secrets in the same physical space, accepting that any connection, if it emerged, would require time, support and much adjustment to exist in a healthy way. The incompleteness of the initial reunion meant that the subsequent phase could not be considered an emotional curtain call, but instead became a prolonged process where the psychological, legal, and social consequences began to manifest more clearly as the initial emotions subsided. Long-term psychological support was identified as the most critical pillar because the collision between two lives separated for decades could not be addressed through just a few short meetings, and both the victim and the biological family had to confront different forms of stress arising after the encounter. For the victim, integrating the newly confirmed identity into their current life required ongoing therapy to address feelings of disorientation, internal conflicts, and questions about the value of relationships formed previously, while the biological family needed support to process the quiet disappointment of realizing that finding their child did not equate to restoring family roles as they once were. Experts focused on helping each side establish healthy boundaries, encouraging the adaptation process to unfold at an individual pace rather than being rushed by collective expectations. Alongside psychological support, adjusting legal identity posed a series of complex decisions, as the current identity was not just a name but tied to employment history, assets, legal obligations, and a social network built over many years. This process required close coordination among relevant authorities to ensure that recognizing the identity as John Jones did not disrupt existing legal rights, while facilitating necessary document changes in a way that respected personal choices. The adjustment was not imposed, as the victim had the right to decide the extent and timing of integrating the new identity into their legal life, and this flexibility helped reduce psychological pressure during the sensitive phase. Establishing new relationships between the victim and the biological family proceeded cautiously, not following the traditional parent-child model, but rather like connections being built from scratch among adults. Subsequent meetings, if any, were arranged with appropriate frequency and duration, prioritizing the quality of interactions over quantity, and allowing the parties to adjust expectations based on reality. Forming clear communication rules, including topics to avoid and boundaries to respect, helped minimize conflicts and feelings of privacy invasion. Media pressure began to increase as news of the victim being found after decades attracted widespread attention, creating a new challenge that neither side had much experience handling. Public interest, even if well-intentioned, risked turning a personal story into a public event, forcing the victim and family to carefully consider the level of information shared. Communication strategies were developed to protect privacy, prevent the identity and past from being exploited in harmful ways, while allowing necessary information to be provided to counter rumors and misinformation. Controlling information became part of the post-reunion process, not only to protect the victim but also to ease pressure on the biological family, who had already endured years living under the community's curious gaze. In this context, the investigation continued in a different direction from before, focusing on clarifying the mechanisms that allowed the identity change to occur and persist over a long period, as well as determining the responsibility of involved individuals or systems. However, this investigation was conducted alongside psychological protection measures for the victim, ensuring that the pursuit of truth did not re-trigger recently stirred traumas. Investigators coordinated with support teams to balance the need to clarify the case with the victim's right to stability, recognizing that any overly hasty step could worsen the recovery process. Post-reunion, therefore, was not a calm phase but a series of continuous adjustments, where every decision had to consider multidimensional impacts on psychology, law, and society. New relationships were tested over time, not through intense emotional moments, but through patience and the ability to accept limits that could not be overcome immediately. Long-term psychological support helped the parties understand that feelings of alienation, disappointment, or exhaustion were not signs of failure but natural responses to an event that altered life structure. Gradual legal identity adjustment became a tool for the victim to regain a sense of control, while effectively managed media pressure protected the private space needed for adaptation. In that post-reunion picture, the most important thing was not the speed of progress, but maintaining a safe enough environment for the parties to continue dialogue, healing, and if possible, building new connections based on mutual respect, while the investigation quietly proceeded to clarify what remained unexplained. The fact that post-reunion life gradually settled into a new orbit did not end the need to clarify the remaining parts of the case, because the truth about identity only answered the question, who, while the question who caused this remained an unignorable legal and ethical void. The pursuit of the perpetrator was reactivated in a completely different context from 4 decades earlier, when the file was no longer an unsolved missing person case, but a prolonged abduction with a living victim, carrying serious human rights implications. Reviewing old suspects became a mandatory starting point, as even after many years, individuals previously under suspicion still represented possibilities that needed re-evaluation in light of new data. Investigators returned to this list not assuming the answer was already there, but to determine whether suspicions previously dismissed were truly baseless or merely limited by technology and investigative methods at the time. Each suspect's file was reopened, cross-referenced with current data on geography, timing, and social connections, to identify any new matches when compared to the confirmed victim identity information. Simultaneously, new evidence was carefully cross-checked, including not only DNA data, but also indirect information such as administrative records, old statements, and traces previously deemed insufficient to pursue. This cross-checking was not aimed at finding absolute proof overnight, but at assessing whether any direction had enough basis for deeper investigation without falling into speculation. Investigators paid special attention to determining realistic prosecutability, because after decades, the question was not just who did it, but what can be done with that information under current law. Assessing prosecutability required considering evidence sufficiency, witness availability, and the legality of evidence collected in different case phases. Many potential leads, though ethically suggestive, did not meet the legal threshold for court, especially with increasingly strict proof standards. Statute of limitations became a major barrier, as not all related acts could be prosecuted after such a long time, and determining applicable charges had to be based on laws at the time of the act as well as subsequent amendments. Investigators and legal experts had to carefully weigh the desire for justice against the reality that the legal system has insurmountable limits, even in morally outrageous cases. Facing these limits did not mean abandoning the pursuit of truth, but acknowledging that criminal justice cannot always fully meet the closure needs of the victim and family. The justice system's limitations became evident when investigators realized that some clearly wrongful acts were beyond prosecution due to expired statutes or substandard evidence, creating a sense of helplessness not only for the family, but also for those conducting the investigation. In this context, pursuing the perpetrator was no longer solely about bringing someone to trial, but also about establishing the historical truth of the case, clarifying what happened so the victim did not have to continue living with unanswered questions. Internal reviews, file analyses, and legal consultations proceeded alongside caution in communicating with the victim to avoid creating unrealistic expectations about prosecution. The investigating agency had to balance continuing to pursue remaining leads with protecting the victim's psychological stability, who had just undergone personal identity redefinition. In this process, not every discovery led to concrete action, but each review step helped narrow the scope of the unknown, contributing to a clearer overall case picture. Prosecutability assessments were continuously updated as new data was analyzed, but also accompanied by acceptance that some questions might never be answered within criminal law. Pursuing the perpetrator in this phase, therefore, was as symbolic as it was practical, as it demonstrated the system's commitment to not forgetting the victim, even if the final outcome was not a conviction. Awareness of the justice system's limits did not diminish the value of investigative efforts, but instead emphasized the importance of documenting and preserving truth as part of societal responsibility. In this context, pursuing the perpetrator became a process oriented toward both justice and legal reality, where every decision had to weigh the potential for specific results against the risk of causing further harm if expectations were not properly managed. The fact that pursuing the perpetrator had to stop before clear legal limits did not mean the overall case picture was complete. On the contrary, it exposed a deeper and more complex layer of questions, where the truth was obscured not only by time but also by silent mechanisms that allowed a tragedy to exist outside the system's view for decades. The biggest unresolved question was how the false identity was created, not in a general sense, but at a specific level, sufficient for a person to live, study, receive medical care, and participate in society, without any serious anomalies being detected. Records showed this identity did not form from a single act or impulsive decision, but was the result of a deliberate series of interventions spanning many years, exploiting blind spots in the administrative system of that era, when local agencies operated relatively independently. Data was not digitized, and verification relied heavily on physical documents and interpersonal trust. Key milestones, like replacement birth certificates, school enrollment records without original documents, or interrupted medical records, were not unusual in isolation, but when viewed together revealed a consistent pattern. Every trace back to origins was severed from the start. The question of who actively carried out or directed this chain of actions remained undetermined. As most original documents were lost, many involved individuals could no longer provide statements, and the line between intentional fraud and administrative negligence was hard to distinguish after decades. This raised unavoidable suspicions about potential accomplices, because maintaining a false identity over a long period was rarely the work of a lone individual in a vacuum. Although no direct evidence proved multiple involvement, the consistency in avoiding key checkpoints suggested at least passive support, systematic overlooking, or flexible decisions by various parties at different times. However, identifying accomplices, if any, was nearly impossible under current law. As time had blurred context, personal motives were hard to reconstruct, and legal responsibility was difficult to assign without an unbroken evidence chain. Another central question was the motive for selecting the victim, as initial records showed John Jones did not belong to a high-risk group or have special circumstances making him easily targeted per familiar patterns. The family was not in the most socially vulnerable position, daily routines showed no clear recurring risks, and the disappearance occurred on such an ordinary day that no one realized it was the last moment of an old life. Selecting a normal child meant the motive could not be inferred from obvious benefits or specific goals, forcing hypotheses to revolve around hard-to-verify factors like vague acquaintances, random opportunity, or personal selection criteria not reflected in records. These hypotheses, though theoretically reasonable, could not be verified due to lack of direct data about the intervener, leaving the true motive in the gray area between grounded speculation and information gaps. This led to haunting suspicions about possible other victims, because if one identity concealment mechanism operated smoothly for so long, the question arose whether this was an isolated case or just a rare late-discovered example. The absence of direct links to similar cases was not enough to rule out other victims, especially given the unstandardized missing person reporting and investigation systems of that era, where many cases might have been recorded disjointedly, inaccurately, or not connected. However, expanding investigation in this direction faced severe limits, as there was no strong enough data to link isolated cases into a substantiated series, and any broad inference risked unfounded conclusions harming unrelated individuals. The unresolved issues thus did not exist independently, but overlapped, forming a web of questions where opening one possibility simultaneously slammed shut others, due to lack of evidence. The truth gaps lay not only in the unknown but also in the unknowable physical evidence gone, witness memories faded or absent, and the social context that enabled concealment changed beyond accurate reconstruction. For the victim, these gaps held deep personal meaning, representing irretrievable stolen years and unanswerable questions about their own origins. For the family, it was the absence of a complete explanation for the tragedy that shaped their lives for decades. For the investigation system, these gaps were a harsh reminder of justice's limits against time, where modern science could confirm identity, but not fully replace contemporaneous evidence and timely statements. Acknowledging unresolved issues was not surrendering to uncertainty, but choosing honesty to avoid fabricated conclusions just to fill silence. It required a clear boundary between what was proven and what could only be speculated, between establishable truth and hypotheses kept open. In this context, the case's remainder was no longer measured by answers achieved, but by transparency in recognizing persisting limits, so the file did not become a falsely closed story, but an honest record of the journey to the final boundary of understanding. The truth gaps pointed out previously did not disappear when the official investigation reached its end, but they shaped how the case was closed honestly and responsibly, rather than with an imposed complete conclusion. At the most core level, the John Jones case was partially resolved in the practical sense of the modern justice system. The biggest question haunting the family, community and investigative file for over 4 decades, whether the child missing since 1980 was alive or dead, received a verified answer, proven by science and legally recognized. The victim being found alive and identity confirmed not only ended the prolonged not knowing state, but completely changed the case's nature, shifting it from an indefinite missing person file to a prolonged abduction and identity concealment, with profound impacts on personhood and human rights. However, this resolution did not resemble an absolute victory, as questions about the perpetrator, motive, and entire mechanism enabling the events remained unanswerable fully under current law. The case was thus resolved in terms of personhood, but left open criminally, creating a fragmented outcome reflecting the reality of many multi-generational cold cases. The decision to close the file came after careful consideration between the duty to continue pursuing truth and the responsibility not to maintain a prolonged investigative state merely formal, when all feasible tools had been used without prospect of specific legal results. This closure was not abandonment or admission of failure, but recognition that the system had reached its reasonable limit, where prolonging investigation risked further psychological harm to the victim and family without commensurate value. The file was updated with the new conclusion, clearly noting that the case was no longer a cold case in the sense of an unidentified victim, but one with highly certain confirmed identity, while fully and transparently listing unresolved issues to avoid a false sense of closure. The case's significance for cold cases extended far beyond John Jones' personal story, as it demonstrated that files seemingly buried by time could still be revived when three factors converged: preserved data, suitable technology, and timely personal decisions. This case highlighted the power of DNA testing and genetic genealogy in breaking decades-long deadlocks, while emphasizing the importance of preserving records, even those once deemed unsolvable, as a long-term commitment to justice. At the same time, the case exposed inherent justice system limits, where scientific truth does not always lead to criminal accountability, especially when time has eroded evidence, memories, and applicable legal frameworks. The parallel between scientific progress and legal limits became a central lesson for modern investigative agencies. Strong investment in new technology and methods is needed, but clear ethical standards in managing victim and family expectations are also essential. Avoiding promises of results the system cannot guarantee. For the victim, file closure held dual meaning: official confirmation of a stolen identity, and life bent by an uncontrollable event, alongside acceptance that not all past questions could be fully answered. This closure milestone did not end the personal journey, but created an important psychological boundary, allowing the victim to distinguish between continuing to seek the unattainable and focusing on building current life with confirmed truth. For the biological family, investigation's end marked the conclusion of indefinite waiting, where hope and despair intertwined for years, replaced by a specific though imperfect truth, sufficient for shifting from searching to remembrance, adaptation, and life restructuring. At the system level, archiving and closing the investigation were done with awareness that this file would remain an important reference document, digitized, categorized, and preserved to modern standards, ensuring that if future new data, technology, or legal changes emerged, the case could be re-accessed and reassessed without rebuilding the entire process. The case's conclusion thus lay, not in a verdict or confession, but in responsibly confirmed and recorded truth, along with transparent acknowledgement of persisting limits. That transparency created the file's lasting value, not as a perfectly ended story, but as evidence of how the system can approach truth as closely as possible under real conditions. When the file was officially archived and the investigation closed, the case did not vanish from history, but became part of the collective memory of cold cases, where each contributes lessons about not abandoning old files, science's role in breaking deadlocks, and the system's ethical responsibility when facing people who lived entire lives in the gray area of unnamed truth. The story of John Jones reminds Americans today that safety is sometimes just a feeling, not a real protective system. In 1980, John's family lived in a quiet California suburb, where kids moved freely, and adults easily believed a few minutes of inattention was no big deal. The moment John slipped from witness view, combined with initial danger signals being rationalized, created the decisive gap, and that gap later became the blind spot of the entire investigation. The practical lesson for life in the United States today is turn vigilance into specific habits, not vague fear. For families with young children, agree on a simple emergency script. If a child loses contact for more than a few minutes in public, adults must act immediately: call for on-site help, describe appearance, secure the area, instead of waiting. For the community, the story shows secondary witnesses caused investigative chaos due to conflicting statements, and some hiding information out of fear of involvement. So when seeing something unusual, record details right away, license plate, vehicle features, direction, and report to authorities as soon as possible. Don't let "I'm not sure" become a reason for silence. Finally, the DNA turning point in the story reminds that technology can save people, but only works when data is preserved, and individuals actively use legal tools. Keep important records, documents, photos, medical info, update the most recent child photos, and understand privacy rights with DNA testing, because sometimes a seemingly ordinary decision opens the door to truth after decades. If you believe stories like John Jones's need to be told to remind us never to forget old files and the people behind them, please subscribe to the channel to follow more cases solved through persistence and modern science. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue seeking truth for stories seemingly buried by time.